The average American family spends hundreds of dollars a month on beef, and most of that money is being thrown away without anyone realizing it. A Japanese family buying the exact same steaks at the exact same grocery store saves hundreds of dollars off that bill every single month. There is a 22-pound bag of beef sitting on my kitchen counter, bought this morning from an ordinary supermarket for $120. In most homes across this country, that same $120 only buys 4 steaks on a foam tray, enough for one dinner and nothing else. Out of this bag, I have already taken 14 steaks, 1 roast big enough to feed 6 people on a Sunday, 3 pounds of trim for burgers later in the week, and a small jar of rendered beef fat cooling on the back burner for tomorrow morning. Same store, same money, 4 times the food. It did not require a coupon, a warehouse club card, or a special trip to an Asian grocer, and every single step can be done in an ordinary kitchen with the equipment already sitting in your drawers. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through the simple habits that let a Japanese family cut a steak bill in half, starting with the single technique that changes everything else that follows. The single largest source of savings in the entire Japanese approach to beef has nothing to do with what steak is bought or where it is bought, and everything to do with what happens to that steak on the cutting board once it comes home. In the yakiniku houses of Osaka and the shabu-shabu restaurants of every major Japanese city, a single steak is never treated as a single serving. The Japanese approach begins with the assumption that one thick American-style steak can comfortably feed 4 people if it is sliced properly. And once you have seen a steak served that way, even once the whole idea of a single steak per person begins to look wasteful. You take a piece of beef that would normally serve 1 person as an 8-ounce slab, and you place it in the freezer for about 20 to 30 minutes until it is firm on the outside but still slightly soft in the center. Cold beef is the whole trick, because a soft steak at room temperature will tear and smear under the knife, while a firm cold one will cut into clean uniform ribbons that all look like they came from a professional kitchen. If the meat begins to soften halfway through slicing, you simply return it to the refrigerator for 15 minutes and finish the job once it has firmed up again. Once the meat is chilled, you find the direction of the grain, which will show up as long parallel lines running through the muscle, and you slice at a right angle to those lines into pieces about the thickness of a coin. That single steak now becomes a small pile of tender ribbons that will sear in a hot pan in less than a minute per side, and every one of those ribbons is more tender than the whole steak would have been because cutting across the grain shortens the muscle fibers in every bite. The habit of always slicing across the grain is drilled into every professional Japanese cook from the first day of training, and it becomes especially valuable for cheaper cuts like skirt, flank, and hanger, all of which have very pronounced grain and eat like leather if sliced the wrong way. Those thin cross-grain slices are the raw material for the entire Japanese repertoire of beef dinners, from a plate of grilled meat over rice, to a hot pot of light broth for dipping, to strips wrapped around scallions and grilled over open flame, to a rice bowl called gyudon that has fed working families in Tokyo for more than a century. Gyudon is the clearest example of the whole idea, because a single portion of it uses only about 3 ounces of beef simmered briefly in a sweet savory sauce of soy, mirin, and sugar, then served over a full cup of hot rice that fills the bowl and satisfies a full appetite. A 12-ounce ribeye that costs about $22 and would feed 1.5 Americans as a plated meal will instead feed 4 full-size gyudon bowls, dropping the cost per person from roughly $15 down to $5.50. The flavor of the beef actually deepens when it is cooked briefly in the sweet sauce, so the meal often tastes more satisfying than a plain grilled steak on a plate would have. A family that eats steak this way 3 nights a week saves close to $300 a month without ever changing what they buy at the supermarket, and the same principle carries over to every other Japanese beef dish, from steak donburi with grilled slices over rice, to beef and scallion bowls, to negamaki rolls wrapped and grilled over open flame, all built on the same modest 3 ounces of protein per person. Once every steak in your kitchen is going to be sliced into thin ribbons anyway, the shape and appearance of what you actually buy at the supermarket becomes almost irrelevant. And this opens up a part of the meat case that most American shoppers walk past every single week without a second glance. On the bottom shelf of almost every American supermarket meat case, there is a small plastic tray that costs less than half the price of everything above it. The Japanese call this tray kiriotoshi, which translates simply as end cuts, and it contains the small, irregular pieces of steak that were trimmed away when the butcher was cutting the neat uniform slabs displayed at eye level. The meat is exactly the same grade, from exactly the same animal, cut by exactly the same knife on exactly the same morning as the pretty steaks above it. The only difference is that the pieces are odd, shaped, and awkward looking, which is precisely why most American shoppers never see them. American supermarkets sell these end cuts under a handful of different names, including steak tips, beef trim, stir-fry beef, stew pieces, and sometimes just discounted beef pieces, and they are almost always tucked away on the lowest shelf where most eyes never travel. A pound of ribeye displayed as neat slabs might cost $22, while the same weight of the same ribeye sold as end cuts from the same animal will cost $8 or $9, a saving of close to $15 a pound on the exact same beef. And once every piece is being sliced across the grain into ribbons, before it hits the pan, the difference in appearance disappears entirely on the plate. Small tricks like that one are exactly the kind of thinking that keeps a Japanese kitchen running for less, and there are hundreds more habits like it that I have pulled together into my book called The Complete Japanese Kitchen Handbook. It shows you how to cut hundreds of dollars off your grocery bill every month, keep the pantry from ever going to waste, and turn the cheapest ingredients on the shelf into meals your family will actually love. You can find the book over at frugaljapan.shop by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description below for instant access. Choosing the right cheap cut is only half of the shopping habit, because whether you are buying the end cuts or the standard steaks, the way a Japanese cook picks among them is completely different from how most shoppers walk up to the meat case. Most people pick their steak by looking at the grade stamp on the label, choice or prime, and paying whatever price matches the stamp. Japanese shoppers ignore the sticker almost entirely and read the meat itself with their eyes, looking for the finest and most evenly spread network of white fat lines running through the pink muscle, because that marbling is where every drop of flavor and tenderness in a piece of beef actually lives. The reason this works is that American beef is graded by looking at only one small spot on the carcass, specifically the ribeye muscle between the 12th and 13th rib, and the marbling in any given cut can vary enormously from that one grading point. Two steaks stamped choice in the same case on the same morning can differ enormously in marbling, and the one with the tighter and more evenly distributed webbing of white fat will taste like prime while costing you the price of choice. This one habit of looking past the label and reading the meat with your own eyes routinely hands you a piece of beef that tastes $10 a pound more expensive than what you actually paid for it, and it costs you nothing more than an extra minute of looking at the case. The last piece of the shopping habit is timing, and it works because American supermarkets follow the same evening markdown pattern that Japanese stores made famous. Somewhere between 6 and 8 in the evening in almost every large American grocery chain, a member of the meat department staff walks through with a roll of yellow stickers and marks down every steak that will not sell before its date. The Japanese word for this practice is yugata werabiki, which means evening discount, and Japanese shoppers time their weekly steak buying to the exact hour when those stickers come out. The first round is usually 20% off, and as closing time approaches, the same steaks drop to 30, then 40, and sometimes as much as 50% off the original price. A ribeye that was $22 a pound at 3 in the afternoon can be $11 a pound by 8 in the evening, and it is the exact same piece of beef cut on the exact same morning. Shifting your weekly steak trip from a Saturday afternoon to a weeknight evening between 6 and 8 will save a household more than $200 a month without changing a single thing about what ends up in the cart, and the exact best hour varies from store to store, so it is worth walking through your local meat department once or twice around dinner time to figure out when the stickers actually come out in your part of town. Within any American meat case, there are 3 specific cuts of beef that a Japanese cook will pick up over and over again, and every one of them sits at a fraction of the price of the ribeye and the strip steak that most American shoppers reach for out of habit. The first is harami, which is called outside skirt steak in the United States and can be found either at the meat case or ordered from the butcher counter for around $8 a pound. Harami has a deep, beefy flavor and a loose, open grain that soaks up a marinade faster than almost any other cut of beef, and it becomes tender in a matter of minutes on a hot pan rather than the hours that most cheap cuts of beef require. The second is zabuton, which comes from the chuck flap of the shoulder and is sold in American supermarkets as Denver steak or occasionally as chuck flap tail. Zabuton is one of the most heavily marbled cuts on the entire animal, and pound for pound it delivers more of that fine white fat that makes beef taste like beef than any other cheap cut in the store, at somewhere between $7 and $9 a pound. The third is Miss Huji, which American butchers call top blade steak, and which comes from a small muscle sitting inside the shoulder blade. Misuji has a texture that eats halfway between a steak and a rich, tender pot roast, and it carries a distinctive line of soft connective tissue running down the center that melts into the meat when the steak is cooked hot and fast in a very hot pan. All three of these cuts sit somewhere between $6 and $10 a pound in the American supermarket, while ribeye and strip steak from the exact same animal sell for $18 to $25 a pound. Switching a regular steak dinner from ribeye to any one of these three cuts saves roughly $12 a pound of beef, and a family that eats steak twice a week will find themselves close to $200 ahead at the end of the month while eating meals that most yakiniku cooks in Japan would consider more interesting than a plain ribeye. A few American butchers will still cut all three of these pieces to order if you ask for them by name, and larger warehouse clubs like Costco and Sam's Club stock zabuton and harami on a regular basis under their American names. Once you know how each of them behaves in a hot pan and how each of them reacts to a marinade, you will find yourself walking past the ribeye case entirely on most trips to the supermarket and treating those three cuts as your everyday choice. Cheap cuts of beef become truly worthwhile only when they are handled in a way that makes them eat like the expensive cuts they replaced. And 3 Japanese tenderizing techniques will turn any of the cuts above into something that tastes like it cost 3 times what it did. The first is shio koji, a soft white paste of fermented rice, salt, and water that has been used in Japanese kitchens for centuries and is now available in the international aisle of most large American supermarkets and in every Asian grocery store in this country. The natural enzymes in the koji break down the tough proteins in inexpensive cuts of beef, and a single overnight marinade in shio koji will transform a $6 a pound flank steak into something that eats with the soft melting texture of a $20 filet mignon. You spread a thin layer of the paste over both sides of the steak, seal it in a bag or a covered dish, and leave it in the refrigerator for 6 to 24 hours. Before cooking, you wipe off the excess paste with a paper towel and sear the steak in a hot pan the way you normally would. A single jar of shio koji costs about $8 and tenderizes dozens of steaks over the following months, which makes it one of the highest returns per dollar of any Japanese ingredient sitting on an American supermarket shelf. The second tenderizing technique uses nothing more than a whole yellow onion, and it works because raw onion contains the same kind of natural enzymes that break down the connective tissue in meat. You peel and grate a whole onion on a fine grater until you have about half a cup of pulp and juice, then mix it with soy sauce, mirin, a small splash of sake, and a little grated ginger and garlic before pouring the whole mixture over your steak in a sealed bag. 2 hours in this marinade will completely change a tough piece of chuck or flank, and 4 hours will make it as tender as a fillet at a fraction of the price. Before cooking, you brush off the onion pulp with a paper towel, then sear the beef in a hot pan and finish it the way you would any other steak. The ingredients cost less than $1 per batch, and the technique works reliably on cuts of beef that sell for $6 to $8 a pound, turning them into dinners that eat like beef that would normally cost $20. A family that adopts this one technique for 2 dinners a week saves close to $180 a month on the difference between the cheap cuts and the premium cuts they used to buy. The third tenderizing technique costs nothing at all beyond the beef you already bought, and it turns an ordinary supermarket steak into something that most butcher shops would sell for 3 times as much. Dry aging beef in a normal home refrigerator has been practiced in Japanese kitchens for decades, and it requires no cabinet, no fan, no bag, and no equipment that is not already sitting in your kitchen. You take a piece of steak that is at least 1.5 inches thick, pat it completely dry with paper towels, sprinkle a light layer of coarse salt over the entire surface, and wrap it loosely in fresh paper towels. You set it on a small rack over a plate in the coldest part of your refrigerator, Then change the paper towels once a day for 4 to 5 days. During that time, the paper draws moisture off the surface, the cold air concentrates the flavor, and the natural enzymes in the meat gradually break down the muscle fibers to produce that deep, nutty aged character that commercial dry aged steak is famous for. At the end of the 5th day, you trim off the dried outer layer, which will be no more than 1/8 of an inch, and you are left with a piece of beef that would cost you $35 to $45 a pound at a specialty butcher shop and cost you $12 a pound to age at home. A family that dry ages a piece of beef once a week saves close to $100 a month while eating steak that most people can only afford as a rare special occasion. Every one of these techniques uses beef more efficiently than the American default, but the deepest layer of savings in a Japanese kitchen comes from what happens to the parts of the beef that most Americans throw straight into the trash. This is where the philosophy of Matanai reveals itself fully, and the practice that follows from it is the reason a Japanese cook can get a full week of flavor out of a single steak. Every steak in every supermarket comes with a rim of white fat around the edge, and while most American cooks trim it off and drop it in the trash without a thought, Japanese cooks collect that fat carefully into a small container in the freezer until they have enough to render down into what the Japanese call gyuabura. This is pure beef tallow, the same cooking fat that carried Japanese kitchens for generations before industrial seed oils arrived on supermarket shelves. You place all your collected trimmings into a heavy pot with a small splash of water to prevent burning in the first few minutes, then cook it on the lowest possible heat for 2 to 3 hours until every drop of fat has melted into a clear golden liquid and only small crisp brown pieces remain in the bottom of the pot. You strain the liquid through a fine mesh sieve into a clean jar, and the tallow will keep for months in the refrigerator without any preservatives or special handling. Using this rendered fat to sear your next steak in place of butter or oil adds a rich, beefy character that no other cooking fat can match, and the small, crisp brown pieces left behind in the strainer are called obura kasu and get scattered over rice or noodles as a savory topping that most American families would never think to eat. For long-term storage, the tallow gets poured into an ordinary ice cube tray while it is still liquid and then frozen solid, which is a Japanese trick that turns a single afternoon of rendering into 6 months of ready-to-use cooking fat. Each cube holds roughly 1 tablespoon of pure beef fat, which is the exact amount you need to sear a single steak or start a stir-fry, and once the cubes are frozen, you pop them out and transfer them into a labeled freezer bag. When you need one, you simply drop it straight into a hot pan and it melts in seconds, releasing that deep, beefy aroma that turns even a cheap cut of steak into something that tastes like it came from a much more expensive kitchen. A family that renders and freezes tallow this way ends up replacing almost every other cooking fat in the kitchen with a free byproduct of beef they already bought, saving another $15 to $20 a month on butter and oil over the course of the year. And the same tallow can be used to roast potatoes, to fry an egg, to sear vegetables, and to finish a bowl of ramen with a final glossy shine. The same principle of using every part of the animal carries over to something most American shoppers do not even realize they can ask for at the meat counter, which is beef bones. Japanese butchers sell beef bones for $1 or $2 a pound, and in most American supermarkets, the butcher will hand them over for free or for a very small charge if you simply walk up and ask, because most of the bones from the day's cutting end up in the trash by closing time anyway. You take those bones home, roast them in a hot oven for about 40 minutes until they are deeply browned on every side, then simmer them in a large pot of water for 6 to 8 hours with a piece of ginger, a scallion, and a small splash of soy sauce. What comes out of that pot is called jukotsu broth, a rich, beefy stock that costs almost nothing to make and replaces every carton of store-bought beef broth in your pantry, saving another $25 a month for a household that cooks with broth regularly. You can freeze the finished broth in ice cube trays the same way you froze the tallow, and each cube adds real beef flavor to a soup, a stew, a rice dish, or a pan sauce whenever you need it. The same freezer that stores the tallow does the last piece of the work, holding pre-portioned flat bags of thin-sliced marinated beef that turn a single Sunday afternoon into a full week of ready-to-cook weeknight dinners. You take your sliced beef, divide it into portions of about 8 ounces each, and place each portion in a small freezer bag with a different marinade in each bag. one with soy sauce and ginger for a simple yakiniku, one with shio koji for a tender seikyo yaki, one with the grated onion marinade for a Sunday steak. You press each bag flat, squeeze out as much air as possible, then stack them in the freezer where they take up almost no room at all. The freezing and thawing process pulls the marinade deeper into the meat than a refrigerator marinade ever could, because the ice crystals rupture the cell walls of the beef and open up new pathways for the flavor to travel. When dinner time comes on a busy Tuesday, you thaw a flat bag in a bowl of cool water for 20 minutes, and the beef is ready for the pan, which eliminates the entire temptation to order expensive takeout on a night when nothing has been prepared and everyone is tired. A family that prepares 6 of these bags on a Sunday afternoon has 6 weeknight dinners already handled, and the savings compared to takeout or restaurant meals average close to $300 a month for a household that would otherwise order in. None of the slicing and marinating work pays off unless the beef is actually cooked correctly once it hits the pan. And this is another place where a Japanese kitchen does things differently from the average American stove. Thin cross-grained slices of beef need a screaming hot pan in almost no time at all, usually somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds per side, because the whole surface of the ribbon is exposed and it cooks through almost instantly. Most home cooks make the mistake of crowding the pan with too much beef at once, which drops the temperature and turns the meat gray and rubbery instead of brown and caramelized. The Japanese approach is to work in small batches, no more than a single layer of beef in the pan at a time, and to let the pan return to full heat between each batch. Every batch takes less than a minute, and the caramelization that builds on the surface of each slice is where all of the deep beefy flavor actually lives. Cooking thin beef this way also produces almost no shrinkage, which means the 8 ounces of beef you started with is still close to 8 ounces when it lands on the plate, and none of the money you spent has been lost to a puddle of gray liquid in the bottom of the pan. The final piece of the Japanese approach is what happens to any beef that does not get eaten on the night it was cooked, because a Japanese kitchen treats leftover steak as the beginning of a completely new meal rather than as sad reheated food from the night before. Cold thin sliced beef gets tossed with a simple dressing of ponzu, sesame oil, and a scatter of fresh scallions to make a light beef salad that can carry a whole lunch on its own. Small pieces of leftover beef get chopped and simmered briefly with soy sauce, mirin, and a little sugar to make a thick, savory topping called tsukudani that keeps in the refrigerator for 2 weeks and turns a plain bowl of rice into a full dinner. The most beloved use of leftover steak is a dish called beef ochazuke, where a handful of the cold slices is placed over a bowl of hot rice, and the whole thing is finished with a pour of hot green tea or dashi that gently warms the beef through without overcooking it. Every one of these dishes turns a small amount of beef into a full, satisfying meal at no additional cost, and it is the reason a Japanese family never sees a single ounce of steak go to waste in a plastic container at the back of the fridge. There's 2 things I want to say before we continue. The first is that every single technique described here requires a small amount of prep time up front, usually about 1 hour on a Sunday afternoon, and if that hour is not available, then most of the savings will not follow. The Japanese kitchen runs on Sunday preparation, and the weeknight dinners it produces are only cheap because the work was already done a few days earlier. The second is that home dry aging in a refrigerator for 4 or 5 days is a genuine improvement in flavor and tenderness, but it is not the same thing as commercial 30-day dry aging, which develops a completely different set of nutty aged flavors and requires more controlled humidity than a home refrigerator can provide. If you enjoy the deep, funky character of a proper 30-day aged steak, home aging will not fully replace it, but it will give you 80% of the way there for none of the money that a specialty butcher shop would charge you. The bigger picture worth understanding is that every one of these habits comes down to the same underlying idea, which is that a steak is not one meal for one person. It never was. Americans have been trained by decades of restaurant portioning and marketing images to believe that a proper steak dinner is a full 8 or 10 ounce slab of beef on a single plate for a single adult, and every dollar of that steak's price rides on the shoulders of one dinner. In a Japanese kitchen, the same piece of beef is understood as the beginning of something 4 times as large, a small pile of concentrated protein and fat that will stretch across a family of 4 with tallow left over for the next morning. The savings are not from finding cheaper beef. They are from asking more of every steak you already buy. You have not been paying too much for beef at the supermarket. You have been getting too little back from every piece of it, and every one of the 15 habits described here is really just a small piece of the practice of getting more back. Start with just 3 of these habits this week. The evening markdown trip to the meat case, somewhere between 6 and 8. The cross-grain thin slicing of cold beef on the largest board you own, and one of the tenderizing marinades on the cheapest cut you can find. And by the end of the month, you will notice the difference in your grocery bill and in the quality of the steak that comes off your stove. In my next video, I am going to open the drawers and cabinets of a traditional Japanese kitchen to show you the shelf-stable pantry staples that a Japanese family uses to eat beautifully for pennies a day, ingredients that keep for years and turn even the simplest meal into something remarkable. Thanks so much for watching, and I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know which of these methods you are going to try first, and whether you have already been using any of them in your own kitchen, and I will see you in the next video.